Good morning again. First, as we begin today, I wanted to just acknowledge that this weekend and the holidays surrounding it is probably not very easy for many of us to celebrate, especially right now. We sit in a tension between healthy patriotism and dangerous nationalism. And so we're trying to find our way among both of those things. And we have the tension between a love of country and a worship of country. And how do we live in the place where both of those things are present? And then we have the idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, with the tension of the awareness that the reality is not all people have universal access to those things. So that is hanging here in this time that we share together. So this past weekend, I attended Pride in Raleigh with my son and my daughter. I think we have a picture of my son and daughter. There they are getting ready. So just tremendous group of people behind us. There's a beautiful mass of humanity, and that time was both beautiful and somewhat disheartening. You know, there was so much positivity, so much optimism there, people who were simply there to live authentically and others who were there to celebrate that authenticity. But there were also tangible reminders that there are people who are so threatened by other people's very existence that they feel burdened to go out of their way to protest their joyful experience of this life, their attempt to be fully seen, their desire to simply be. What these people receive without needing to ask or demand it, they want to deny others. And so we came upon a group of street preachers with their signs and their megaphones screaming about God's judgment. And I thought about the people who were there. We're going to hold on this for a second. This is, behind you is a group of preachers, Christians, on milk crates with megaphones and signs and screaming horrible things. And I came upon them and I thought about the fact that these people had made plans to be there, just like the attendees. They had to mark the date on their calendar and prepare. They had made signs. They got batteries for their megaphones. They drove. They found a place to park. They passed hundreds, if not thousands, of these people and had the opportunity to actually meet them as human beings, and instead moved through the crowd, found their designated place, pulled out their milk crates and their signs and their megaphones, and began shouting at these people as they passed by. If you're set on hating people, shouting at instead of talking to people will always make that job easier. Now, the festival had prepared by making these beautifully decorated fabric walls that volunteers held to shield attendees from them, and they had people holding signs, and the sign says, "Please do not engage with protesters. They want to make you angry and ruin your day. Just laugh and ignore them and go have an amazing one." And then there's me. Joe, if you would, there's me. And I'm wearing a shirt that says, "Love is my religion." And behind me is street preacher with his microphone looking very displeased at my presence. And I noticed the "prepare to meet thy God," which is very prominent. So that juxtaposition is something that really hit me again, even though I knew I would see someone like this. Because in the crowd, they had people with party favors and noisemakers, and people were clapping and chanting and singing in an effort to drown out people like this, to serve as a wall between people and those wishing them harm. This was an embodiment of allyship, of advocacy, standing with human beings in solidarity and with proximity against hatred. This is what we are called to do when people are hurt, when people are damaged, when people are overlooked, when people are preyed upon. We are to gather and to be a visible and loud presence that declares our solidarity and our love for one another. You can take the pictures off now, Joe. Thank you. I may call them up later, though. See, what I knew about the preachers that day is that they were self-fulfilling prophets. They were delivering religion with dehumanization and screaming at people with no joy and no kindness of any kind, and then saying to themselves, see, these sinful people reject God. And this kind of treating people with cruelty and then blaming them when they reject that cruelty allows phobic religious people to ignore others' humanity and perpetuate their narrative of the godless, immoral culture, rejecting a Jesus that they made no effort to show them to begin with. So we had this great time down there being among people who simply were there to be seen and to love and to be loved. And we got back to Wake Forest and we were in the parking lot of a shopping center. And my son said, why can't it always be like that? And he said, we're right here and I feel like we've entered the real world again. And I reminded him that we were just at that event. And that now we were here in this place, just like everyone else had dispersed to where they were. And that part of our responsibility is to make our ordinary life more like that experience down in the city. To normalize diversity. And that happens when we see our lives, our daily routine lives, as a form of activism. As Ken alluded to, Pride Month just ended. And it ended with a Supreme Court decision that paved the way for businesses to deny LGBTQ human beings services based on religious objection. And we, who are not members of the LGBTQ community, find ourselves being called to be allies and advocates in a world where it may be a little bit more difficult because the need is even more profound now. I tend to think that allyship during Pride Month is a lot like volunteerism during the holidays. Between Thanksgiving and Christmas, so many people think about the less fortunate around them, right? Opportunities are everywhere and attention is high, but come January, even though the need hasn't subsided at all, most people have moved on because they have seen activism as an event. Juneteenth was 2 weeks ago. And on the morning of June 20th, systemic racism was still present, right? Discrimination and stereotypes based on race were still playing out on the 20th. Pride Month is over, and sadly, discrimination and phobia against LGBTQ people are not. Juneteenth has come and gone, yet white supremacy and systemic racism still remain. Soon, July 4th will be behind us, yet the universal access to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness will still be elusive for many. And these realities, they remind us that the work of people of faith, morality, and conscience is never done. We never graduate from our activism. We never get to the point where, as a society, we're here, right? I've talked a lot in the past. You may not have been here or paying attention when I was saying it, and you were here. But we've talked about the story that we tell ourselves, how powerful that story is. About the fact that in this life, there are all sorts of things that happen, and that many of those things, perhaps most of those things, are neutral. They're not objectively good or bad, but we editorialize in our heads about whether those things are good or bad. I think I shared about getting a brain tumor diagnosis and saying, I wasn't going to decide that this was bad news, just news, and I was going to do what I could with the news. So we decide whether the things that happen are good or bad, and then our internal conditions and our responses are shaped by that story. We are the composers of the narratives in our heads. I believe that. But I also believe that there are times and events that defy this idea. Some things are bad, and we cannot and should not minimize their implications on people or the planet. This has been a bad week for diverse humanity. It's been a bad week for vulnerable people. It's been a bad week for racial equity. It's been a bad week for people buried in student loan debt. And it's been a bad week for those of us who grieve the erasing of so much progress in such a short time, even if we saw it coming. Even if it felt like a foregone conclusion, nothing really prepares you to see your worst fears realized, does it? So it's not good when hard-fought civil rights are taken away from millions of Americans, when our highest court is weaponized by an extremist minority. It's not good when bigotry becomes lawful. It's not good when a marginalized community loses decades of protections in a few hours. So what can good people or flawed people aspiring to goodness, which is what we are, do on a bad week like this? As human beings seeking to embody oneness, what is our response at times like these? More accurately, what is our response in these times, which aren't really like any times? How do we move from here? No, really, how do we move from here, like out of the country? Like some days that's what I think. See, I know what I want to do at times like this. I have a position because of what I do. People say, John, we're looking to you for some guidance or wisdom. And I say, you're looking in the wrong place. Because I know what I want to do right now. I want to quit. I want to pack it in. I want to stop giving a damn. I want to find another place to call home, maybe a bluer state or maybe a kinder nation. I fantasize about that, I'll confess to you. About living somewhere where I don't know what it looks like, I just know that it's different. If I can't do that, I want to at least turn off the news and be oblivious to the losses and the overreach and the regression, like so many people I know who don't seem the least affected by anything happening right now. Do you know the people I'm talking about? Whether they are choosing to be ignorant or they simply are, they don't worry about the things we worry about. They don't dwell on the things we dwell on. They are not grieved in the way that we grieve. So some days I want to retire from the fight for the common good. But I also know that I cannot do any of these things because if I do, and if you do, the same people who are celebrating right now will have an even easier time bending the moral arc of the universe away from justice. I know the street preachers will be more emboldened. They will have fewer barriers between them and those they seek to render invisible, and I am not going to give up my responsibility to be present. Because I know that with all that we have lost, there's always more to lose. And because of that reality, there is always something worth fighting for. Today, I'm going to ask you to be irrational. Because hopelessness is probably the most rational response right now, to be honest. Looking at the rollback of human and civil rights, seeing the compromised Supreme Court gutting the fruit of generations of activism, seeing a twice indicted, twice impeached former president still worshipped, and knowing what we know about people we love and live alongside and the things that they believe and ratify and celebrate. Hopelessness makes sense, but we can't choose hopelessness because that would mean that we concede not only the recent past, but the present and the future as well. Falling into permanent despair or apathy would be giving away the last week, yes, but today and tomorrow too, and I'm not going to give that up. Because it would mean that we allow those motivated by fear and exclusion to win the battle uncontested. Because most importantly, hopelessness cedes the space within our heads to hateful people. We can't allow the space within our heads to be given away. So hope right now is a bit irrational, but that doesn't mean it's the wrong choice. It's always the right choice because it is the only choice that keeps humanity moving forward. I have one menu option for you. It's hope. There is no other. In the 1940s, Viktor Frankl, a neurologist, a psychiatrist, a philosopher, he found himself in the concentration camps. He was born in Austria. He ended up losing his father, his mother, his brother, and his wife. He ended up earning a PhD in philosophy from the University of Vienna, and he wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning, which is based on his experience in a prolonged period where nearly everything was out of his control and the prospects were extremely dire when life should have felt pointless. And he wrote these words, you may have heard them. Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. And we choose our own way every day we wake up here and are faced with challenges and questions and crises and heartbreak and tragedy. We decide whether circumstances will determine our fate and our internal story or whether we will. That's the decision you're faced with today. Who are you going to allow to write the story in your head? He goes on, he says, between stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. The present, this moment, right now, the one we're sitting in, it's always the space between stimulus and response. In this day, we have one thing. We have the choices that we make. We don't have any guarantees. We don't have control over the courts or the politicians or the systems, even while we work to nudge them in whatever ways we can individually and collectively. What we do in that space between what happens and what we decide to do in response to what happens, that is our activism. Because we've lost a lot. But anything we are losing or fear we are in danger of losing is because someone had to fight for it to begin with. Every bit of equity, every piece of legislation, the smallest arc of the moral universe has come not simply with the passing of time, but with the persistence of the good troublemakers. And I think many of us have lived the last couple of decades thinking that we were safely beyond losing human and civil rights that those before us, or maybe some of us in this room, fought for. We thought it can't happen here again. But the can't happen heres have begun to materialize in recent days. A post-Roe America was once unthinkable and not so long ago. Affirmative action being dismantled was not something we imagined. The possibility of marriage equality being taken away once felt beyond the realm of thinking. And the breathtaking velocity of the overreach and the regression should be alarming to us. It should cause us to grieve, but it should do more than that. It should catalyze us into moving to ensure that there isn't greater mourning in the days and months and decades ahead. And we do that in whatever ways we have possible. What is activism anyway? It's the opposite of inactivism. And we need to see our lives as activism, not an event, but a lifestyle. One that doesn't revolve around a date on the calendar. It's not about a single issue. It doesn't have an expiration. It doesn't depend on circumstance. Because we often think activism is about attending a rally or standing on a street with a sign, yelling at people with a different sign. Or we think about protesting legislation on courthouse steps. And that is part of what activism is, but it's much more than that. And it's about things that are far more difficult to quantify. Friends, I want you to think today about your activism being the daily leveraging of your position, your privilege, your resources, your advantages, your voice, your opportunities, and your circles of influence on behalf of people who have less of those things. I'll say that again. Leveraging your position, privilege, resources, advantages, voice, opportunities, and circles of influence on behalf of people who have less of those things. Activism is just about outwardly embodying your internal convictions. See, I don't know how you believe you are to show up in this world, but I believe that people should be able to look at who we are and what we do with our time and our resources and our social media and be able to reverse engineer what matters to us. I want people to look at my life and then say, you know what I bet he cares about? These people and these causes and this stuff. I don't want it to be a mystery because I was too complacent or too quiet or too lazy or too tired. Activism is about living with our values at the center of our decisions and then living in a way so that those values are tangible. And when I was down at Pride, I saw people living in a way that their values were tangible, whether it was a person with a bullhorn or the person standing as a barrier or the person on the other side fully showing who they were. People often say, John, what can I do? What can I do to make a difference? You see what's happening. You see what's happening in the Supreme Court. You see what's happening with politics and gerrymandering and all these things. What can I do? How can I make a difference? I just tell them that they have their lives as the space for their personal activism, their relational activism. This is where you can be very effective, in the trenches of your relationships, with your family, and at your workplace, and with your friends, and in your social circle, and with your social media. You can perpetuate anything that you want to. You're not at the mercy of the courts just yet. You still have the ability to speak and to leverage your life on behalf of whatever it is that's worth living for. Because if we look at what's been happening, all the boycotts, boycotting a beer company, boycotting a department store, boycotting everything. Why has commercials? The boycotting has come because people have been so outraged by the simple acknowledgement of LGBTQ people's existence, normalizing that existence. That has been so objectionable that they have to boycott and ban and protest. So why this matters for you is because when you have conversations in your ordinary everyday life with people and you push back just a little bit or you share something that you have seen, you get to represent people because representation matters. We see that. And if you're in a conversation with a group of people and there is not a person of color present, you get to at least represent the need of that person to be heard. Or if you're with a group of people in your family and there's not an LGBTQ person because they don't have to have the weight of carrying this, you get to represent them and their humanity. Because this is important. It's not up to black people to fix the racism in America. It's up to white people. It's not up to transgender human beings to fight the battle for transgender human beings' humanity. It's the rest of us who don't have to deal with that. We need to carry our part of the load. That's why we leverage privilege and position as activism. Pride is an event, but allyship is a lifestyle. Juneteenth is a holiday, but anti-racism is a lifestyle. Women's marches are events, but advocacy for women's rights is a lifestyle. Pride is over. July is here. And the courts have handed down some really despicable decisions. And my friend, the street preacher, and those like him and their families and their churches and those who fear what they fear and believe what they believe, they're celebrating today and they are feeling emboldened to be more present and more loud and more visible, and they're going to be. Are we willing to offer an equally present, loud, and visible alternative? Something beautiful, something loving, something redemptive. We do that individually and we do it collectively. We need to be emboldened to show up now, to be the shielders and the joyful noisemakers, and to be a visible and vocal presence that will not allow people to be erased or excluded. This is not a holiday, it's not an event, it's simply life, and we are here and present for it.